I'm just good. So, welcome everyone to the first of our Access Media series, a series on disabled representation in the Irish media. The session that we're covering today is language and ethical storytelling. So you're all really warmly welcomed, and we're delighted to have you join us today. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. As we say, we're trying to limit the chat function to the Q&A this evening, if possible. But if you're having any issues viewing the content on screen, or if you're having issues viewing our interpreters, please do let us know, and we will try and rectify that as we go along as well. As we said, this session is being recorded. So the link to the recording and the slides will be sent to everybody after the session too. We have Irish Sign Language interpretation available. So Catherine and Sarah will be on your screens during this session. And we also have closed captioning available through Zoom. So if you'd like to access that, it's through the CC symbol at the bottom of the screen. So now I'm just going to take you through what Access Media is, what the series is about, and what we aim to do. So Access Media is a 5-part online series running from July to November this year. It's hosted by Disabled Women Ireland and the Disability Participation News Hub, and it's supported by Commission Naman under its Media Skills and Development Programme. And the aim of the series is to raise awareness of the challenges, opportunities, and impact of disabled representation in the media. We also want to support those working in media to create more inclusive spaces and content where disabled people feel authentically represented. So now, before we go any further, I'd like to introduce the rest of the team and speakers here today, and I'm going to hand over to Amy Hassett of Disabled Women Ireland.
Hi folks, I'll keep it short. My name is Amy. I am one of the co-directors of Disabled Women Ireland, and you'll hear from me in a bit.
And Gillian, you next.
I'm Gillian. I am also one of the co-directors of Disabled Women Ireland, and I'm a co-founder of Neuropride Ireland as well. I'm here with my DWI hat on though, but I'll have my Neuropride hat on for one of the sessions later on.
Thanks so much. Nem, can I come to you next?
You can indeed. I'm Nem. I am sibling to Gillian, in case anyone's wondering. I'm also one of the co-founders of Neuropride Ireland and with Disabled Women Ireland since our foundation. Looking forward to speaking with you tonight.
That's perfect. And my name is Nicole Lonican. I'm the founder of the Disability Participation News Hub, and I will be taking you through some of the disability and language section of this session. So just the aims of the session this evening, we want to provide an understanding of disability and the language that we use. We'll cover different forms that representation takes, and then the effects of representation on disabled people too. And at the end of the session, we are going to look at some solutions. So what we can do about this. So now, the first section of our session, we're going to talk about disability and the language that we use. So just a little bit of context on why we're including language in this series and why it's so important. So according to our census in 2022, almost a fifth of the population in Ireland are disabled. So this is really significant portion of a population, and all the more reason to talk about it because language affects so many people here in Ireland. The research when it comes to disabled representation in media shows a lean towards representation focused primarily on disability, secondary roles, tragic and stereotypical presentation. When we're talking about disabled children in particular, it can often be passive, and then we also have inspirational tropes. So this is really important as well to bring up in these conversations and spaces, and we've also included some research for further reading as well at the end of the session. We also want to remember the rights that underpin and protect disabled people when it comes to representation in the media and in public life as well. So, if we're to look to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, there are multiple articles that would protect and cover the representation of disabled people in media. And we're talking about rights like awareness raising, the right to protection against exploitation, the right to privacy, integrity, respect, and also participation in public life too. It's also really important to know that disabled persons organisations and DPOs have published resources, have published position papers, and they have run campaigns on language. So when we look to the collective voice of disabled people, we can see that DPOs, disabled persons organisations, they are investing their time and energy on creating these resources to combat stigma, to ensure that this is, a protection against discrimination as well. And one of the campaigns that I'd like to draw your attention to this evening, maybe after this session, is the Disability Isn't a Dirty Word campaign by Disabled Women Ireland. So we've included links to in the resources as well to some really great resources created by DPOs, and this is one of them. So make sure to have a look at that after the session. So now we'll have a look at what is disability. And I just have a definition here from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the convention describes disability as an evolving concept that results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers. So I'm just going to take that first part of the quote because it's really important, and parse through it a little bit. So it's important here to see that the convention immediately and the drafters are trying to distinguish between disability and impairment, but show the relationship between them. And it shows that disability is not coming from a person's impairment. It's not internal. Disability arises from a person and their impairment with society. It's an external factor. And it's the attitudinal and environmental barriers that are hindering their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So once again, just showing that disability and impairment, two separate things, and that disability is not coming from a person's impairment, it is coming from external factors. And when we talk about impairment, we're talking about a person's experience of a physical, sensory, psychosocial, or cognitive difference. And once again, just based on the social model and human rights model, as well as our convention, disability is coming from the interaction with society and the environment. And some terminology that you might see when it comes to disability and how people choose to identify. You'll often see the terms persons with disabilities or people with disabilities or disabled person or disabled people. And persons with disabilities is an example of person first language. It's also used in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And then disabled person would be an example of identity first language. And this is really related to the social model as well, where we're talking about the external factors that are disabling people in society. What's really important to remember is to respect the choice of the person and the individual and how they choose to identify. But we will go through kind of the history of these terms, where the terminology comes from, and then the models of disability that they're related to as well. So now I'm going to give an overview of this because we could go into multiple sessions of the different models of disability. But this is something to kind of introduce you to the topic, as is many of the topics we'll cover this evening. But it is important because it can give us context as to where these terminology and where these phrases and terms come from, but how they impact disabled people when you're using them in media, when you're reporting, and in content that you create. So if we're to look at the medical model, which is really closely associated with the charity model that Amy will talk a little bit more about later, the medical model focuses on the person's impairment, and it sees disability as caused by the person's impairment. And the medical model is really focused on changing a person, fixing a person, and bringing them up to a societal quote unquote norm. It is widely viewed as outdated by the disabled community and by collectives as well, and one that can potentially as well cause harm because it really does focus on the idea of charity, of care, of treatment, and really medicalizing disability. And examples of terminology that you might see that come along with this and are stemming from the medical model are terms like suffers from and wheelchair bound. And again, it's kind of stripping away the onus that should be on society and the responsibility on society to change the environment, to make our environment and society more accessible and more inclusive, and is really putting the pressure back on a disabled person and on their impairment and where that cause comes from. So next we'll have a look at the social model, and in contrast to our medical model, it focuses on the barriers in society rather than a person's impairment. And it sees disability as caused by external factors to a person. And then terminology that you'll see used with the social model is using the word disabled as a verb. So people are disabled by society and by their environment too. And this goes hand in hand with the human rights model. So they come very closely together, are often used in the same way. So the human rights model of disability, as well as focusing on the barriers in society, it's focusing on rights and dignity, as well as focusing on disability being caused by external factors and that onus being on society. It's also speaking about disabled people as active right holders, as active participants in our community. And as well as using terminology like disabled as a verb, it is now talking about disabled people in terms of rights, autonomy, and dignity. And a really good example of, a recent example of that would be the National Human Rights Strategy for Disabled People, where you're seeing the social model language being used alongside terminology like human rights. So they are just kind of an overview of the models and where that terminology is coming from. And then a really important concept that we have to talk about when we talk about disabled people and language and representation is that of intersectionality. And this is really important because disabled people are not one homogenous group with the same lived experience. Disabled people can have multiple intersecting and overlapping identities. And what this means is that they can be subject to multiple forms of discrimination, as well as systemic oppression as well. So intersectionality is a framework for understanding how multiple social categorizations like race, class, gender, disability, and sexual orientation combine to create unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. And again, this is so important when it comes to representation of disabled people, to make sure that you are, reporting on the stories or showing representation of disabled people from multiple backgrounds and with multiple intersecting identities too. And also to acknowledge that the systemic oppression or discrimination that they are also facing, the multiple forms that they might face. And Kimberlé Crenshaw is the legal scholar who coined the term intersectionality, and she describes it as a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides and where it interlocks and intersects. And now we'll have a look at ableism or disableism. So this is discrimination or unfair treatment based on a person's impairment or disability. And one report that I thought would be really interesting or important in this conversation as well is one by the ESRI in 2024, and we have that linked at the end of the session as well. But this found a higher rate of ableism for some impairments, such as mental health conditions, intellectual disabilities, and autism. And this is important because when we are representing disabled people, whether it's on screen, on radio, in newspapers, it's important to acknowledge that they are facing higher rates of ableism. So the impact of our representation of disabled people is so important in how how our society views disabled people too. And then also linking back to our intersectionality, the report also found a link between sexism and ableism. So again, those intersecting identities, having people at risk of these multiple forms of discrimination too, for example, here with sexism and ableism. So just some takeaways from this section of our session. Disability is an evolving concept. There is a push for social and human rights model by collectives. So as we were talking about those terms, disabled person, social model, human rights model, they are the models and the terminology that are being pushed for by collectives and by DPOs. So consider the language that you're using in your content and whether the representation of disabled people is closer to the charity and medical models or social and human rights models. And then also remember the intersectionality of disabled people and the rights that protect us and any of the rights that align with your work. So I'm going to pass over to Nem now for this section.
Thanks, Nicole. So this is just to kind of build on what some of the ideas that Nicole introduced. Given the increased visibility of neurodivergent people in the media of all forms, in recent years, we thought it would be good to highlight some of the specific language or how these concepts and tropes that Nicole highlighted play out in this space as well. So I'm not going to be able to list the different forms of neurodivergency because it's a massive, massive community with incredibly different experiences within it. Global estimates estimate that about 25% of the population are neurodivergent in some way. And to very briefly kind of sum it up in a sentence, neurodiversity itself is just a scientific fact that speaks to the natural variation among human neurology and brains. Uh, when we talk about neurotypical and neurodivergent, neurotypical just means people whose neurology conforms to the dominant or majority neurotype, and neurodivergent is anyone whose neurology doesn't. It's usually identified with by people whose neurotype differs to such an extent that it has a meaningful impact on their day-to-day life and experience of the world. So, sorry, if you could go forward a slide or two, Nicole. Hey, thank you. So I will be sharing in the resources a guide to language and terms around neurodivergency. I just wanted to highlight a couple that we see misused a lot, and it kind of undermines the neurodiversity paradigm is a human rights framework of understanding, and it works with human rights for other disabled people. So when we it's important that we don't call neurodivergent people neurodiverse or say that neurodiversity is just for those others. Neurodiversity is everyone in society. It is the diversity of humanity. Um, as I said, if you want to talk about the dominant group, you talk about neurotypical, and other people are neurodivergent. Nor can one person be diverse, just like one of anything can't be diverse. So if you're any confusion on that, it will be covered in our resources. And I also just want to highlight neurodivergent is for the whole community whose neurology differs. It isn't a synonym for autistic or a euphemism for anything else. So we'll move on. Sorry. And just I thought I'd just kind of with the increased visibility of neurodivergent people in all forms of media, we are seeing the development and kind of coming together of some very typical tropes. So again, can share information on these in the resources, but kind of like it can be roughly broken down to kind of the savant, the socially ignorant or awkward, highly skilled or intelligent, usually at a technical or nerdy skill. We also have irresponsible, immature, and idiosyncratic. So these aren't broken down by different types of neurodivergency, but they're just kind of stereotypes that neurodivergent representation tends to fall into. So it's childish, immature, comic relief, lazy, or it can also cover where people are always represented as one thing. Obsessive compulsive disorder tends to just be represented as cleaning, and people with Tourette's can tend to be represented with swearing, although those particular experiences are a minority of their respected neurodivergent communities. Um, there's the one that's particularly, so not all of these are harmful. One that is harmful is the infantilization trope, which is very prevalent, and that goes for entertainment, film, TV, but also for factual accounts or journalistic accounts. There's a lot of desexualization of neurodivergent people as well as other disabled people, and viewing them as naive, innocent, childlike. This narrative also means that we puts us in a protective role where we know best and we're looking after the person. So to just move on, none of these tropes, as I said, apart from the infantilization drive, are necessarily harmful or bad. Sometimes they can be really funny. So I just wanted to highlight them more so that we're just aware that we are falling into tropes and stereotypes. And they're also to highlight that the majority of neurodivergent people we see portrayed on our screens across most neurodivergencies are white men, typically cis heterosexual men, which does not reflect the neurodivergent community at all. For example, approximately 70% of autistic people do not identify as cishet, and this has a real world impact. It has been linked to people from ethnically marginalized communities and people who are not men or boys being underdiagnosed, underrecognized, and facing more pushback and bullying in society because they don't fit our picture of what a neurodivergent person looks like. Um, I think Chimananda Ngozi Adichie was talking about kind of racial and national stories when she said this, but I think it applies to all of us. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Sorry, next slide. So I won't be able to cover everything, so I do want to highlight this very common and increasingly used concept of functioning labels and anything associated with it. So functioning labels are things like high functioning, low functioning, but it's also this idea of mild, moderate, severe, profound, autism, ADHD, what have you. It's a complete misunderstanding not only of the neurodiversity paradigm, but of our real experiences and leads to a lot of very real world harms. It's dehumanizing language. It just kind of degrades people on their functioning for society. It limits the humanity and potential, puts people into boxes, highly inaccurate to the lived experience, and it really is a reflection of very outdated medical model thinking. I would include in here language around deficit disorder and disease, anything that pathologizes uh, different ways of being or expressing yourself in the world. It's creating a hierarchy where neurotypical is the correct neurotype and everything else is a deficient or disordered variation of that that needs to be fixed and brought back into line with neurotypicality. And those particularly say non-speaking people or people who also have intellectual disability are placed into a non-low functioning box and fail to be able to conform to an abled or neurotypical way of existing in the world. Uh, I'll pop on to the next slide. Um, this is why functioning labels and all of this sort of deficit-based language is generally highly rejected by the community across the board. Um, Sometimes you get pushback of going, oh, how will I speak about differences between people? So the idea of this is not to eradicate or downplay differences between people, but to remember that people are not functioning units. They're human beings. We don't speak about non-disabled people in terms of their functioning, even though non-disabled people also are better at some things and find other things more challenging. It's to emphasize and remember the humanity, and also to more accurately reflect the real experience, to not put people into low functioning boxes where we just write them off early in life and they're given no opportunities or potential to change or grow or discover their passions or anything else. We can talk about someone having significant, complex, moderate, minimal, or whatever support needs. We can talk about how some individuals will need full-time support or care. That's centering the person and their needs rather than dehumanizing them into outward function on someone else's assessment. We can talk about the impacts that their experiences have in various aspects of their lives. And we can also specify, generally speaking, the low functioning used to be based on an IQ of 70 or under, which was the way of was the cutoff point for intellectual disability. So it also erases the other experience people have, and often people put into that category don't get support for their other experiences. So just kind of point out, as I mentioned it before, but using this kind of framing and language positions neurotypical people as inherently and biologically superior to other human beings and is quite a supremacist way of thinking. So definitely encourage everyone to do their best to avoid that. Um, sorry, Nicole, next slide. And these ones can be what can be tricky is when we use positive language or positive tropes or narratives, and it can slip under the radar that this is also reflecting a tendency to treat disabled people in hierarchies of human beings. So one used very, very often with neurodivergent people, and particularly, but not solely autistic people, is the superpower narrative. Um, it can often be used in a very well-meaning way, but I do want to highlight, and it's absolutely fine to talk about people when some people do have exceptional skills and are exceptionally talented at certain things. That's absolutely fine. But the superpower narrative is actually founded on a supremacist narrative within the autistic community and has links to eugenics. It also has been shown to have uh, negative impacts on mental health of neurodivergent people. And it kind of furthers the idea that you have to have some brilliant breakout skill or talent to compensate for being neurodivergent in order to prove your worth in society. And being neurodivergent is still positioned as a negative, but you might be brilliant, so at one thing, so we'll tolerate you. I said it is a more difficult to spot, but another example of hierarchical thinking among people. And then uh, just kind of why this is such a problem is that I've mentioned some of this before, but it is incredibly important because when I say that the language of functioning or hierarchies or more or less disabled uh, have incredible real world impacts, not just on self-perception and mental health, but they also normalize and perpetuate social biases, which underpin and justify inequality in our society. Some disabled people in Ireland today do not have the same rights under the law due to this very well entrenched hierarchical way of thinking about people and kind of justifying that some people are too low functioning to deserve the human rights that the rest of us share. And that is something I'm passionate about doing away with. People particularly impacted by this are non-speaking people. And just to mention that the community as a whole, prefer non-speaking to non-verbal. A lot of them still communicate verbally, just not in spoken language. People with intellectual disabilities and others with complex support needs. It also has the effect of restricting support and legitimacy to people with less obvious support needs who are not seen as neurodivergent enough and as fakers and posers, which actually leads to increased bullying against people with lower support needs. So it's just negative all around. It creates an us versus them dynamic, which hinders us in creating an accessible society. It pits people against each other. And also to mention that people with mental health, long-term mental health conditions and personality disorders are often at the near the bottom of this hierarchy as well. Their rights and human rights and legal rights in Ireland are restricted under some circumstances too. And in media, there is a bit of a tendency to use personality disorders, which are a form of neurodivergence, as shorthand for moral failings. Those communities have written a lot of guidance on how to portray them realistically in the media without falling into prejudice, but without having to create a false narrative of the real issues that can come up with people experiencing those experiences. So I will try to wrap up without throwing too much at you. Um, so this is just kind of another a disconnected thought, but an important one. Another trope that doesn't really fit into as a specific neurodivergent thing, but just for all marginalized communities. It can be tempting to encourage an audience to recognize um, that different people always have things in common as a way to combat othering and discrimination. This is often very positive, but just to kind of remind us, it can't be our single story. People whose lives, bodies, and experiences are very different to the dominant group also deserve representation, and they deserve not to be kind of reduced to just a caricature, to show those and explore those differences, and to kind of move from we're not so different after all, therefore we should embrace all people, to even if people are very different, they should be embraced. So we all share humanity, but we don't all share experiences, and these differences do deserve recognition too. Uh, uh, and then we're going to explore this later on in the series in more difference. This is just kind of a reminder to be intentional and mindful about the words you use around the framework of your narrative, and what those mean both to the community impacted and to shifting biases that exist that we've inherited in our society. Um, uh, to Nicole's point, the majority of the neurodivergent community also prefer person-first terms, but like any other experience or disabled community, individual preference should be respected. And lastly, I just kind of so said kind of there's a lot of words that are very much in use, and we can see internationally, particularly in places like America, where they're trying to set up camps for neurodivergent people and various other things. This language of epidemic, crisis, all of this, it paints us as a disease. And a threat to the rest of society merely by existing. And there has been a significant and increasing focus on neurodivergent people in both news and entertainment media in the last few years. So this is been brilliant for promoting awareness and acceptance of positive change. It also can be weaponized for was it a couple of terms to throw at you: moral softening, which is the downplaying of harm against the target population, and high risk framing, which focuses us on an identity or marginalized group to blame them for unwanted behavior or paint them as more high risk of harm to society. And we're going to explore those last pieces and that kind of weaponization in session 5 on misinformation and disinformation, for those interested in joining us there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Nim, and I'll take over from here. So, hi folks, I'm Amy, and I'm going to talk about common representations of disabled people in the media. I guess there's only one thing I want to highlight before we get started, which is just that when we talk about representations here, we're not going to necessarily talk about positive ones, but we'll talk about positive experiences that members of our team have had. And I guess the other thing is we're not sort of being too specific about any sort of articles or stuff wherever we can, just because we don't want to necessarily. It's about talking about the issues, not about specific broadcast media or any particular company. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about 3 common representations of disabled people in the media: the supercrip, the burden or the object of care, and a third bonus one at the end. Next slide, please. So, Nicole was telling you earlier about models of disability, and one that I just want to kind of remind you about is the concept of the medical model of disability, which says that kind of a disability is not necessarily, it is something that resides within a person, right? It's something that a person has. It's not about how somebody interacts with their environment. And the problem with the medical model of disability is that it treats non-disability as normal or as a neutral baseline, which it's not. And the responsibility is always on the disabled person to overcome or compensate for their disability. And that leads to the supercrip narrative. Next slide. And so the supercrip narrative is this idea that we often see in many different aspects of media, in TV, in stories of disabled people, where a disabled person is framed as being something extraordinary, something very, fantastic, just for doing very ordinary things like getting a job, getting an education, competing in sports. It's not to say that there's not achievement in that, but there's something where a disabled person doing it is more exceptional. Which is not really the perspective or the view that we want people to have of disabled people. And where it comes from is that people have historically had very low expectations for disabled people. And typically it's people like Paralympians or disabled entrepreneurs or, brave school children for doing very normal things. And it centers the achievement, but only because disability makes it seem less likely that a person is going to do that. And the superscript narrative is very closely related to this concept called inspiration porn, which is on the next slide. So this is a term which was coined by a fantastic advocate called Stella Young back in 2012. We have a link to her TED Talk in our resources, but it's basically, she says that inspiration porn is when disabled people are used as objects for inspiration for a non-disabled audience. So the disabled person doesn't necessarily need to achieve anything, just existing while being disabled is treated as enough. Next slide. And it's very often typified when you see, or examples of this are, you very often see examples of this online, where you see, what I see here is just a person doing exercise, and there's some kind of inspirational quote over the top of it that says something like, "What's your excuse?" And the only reason why this is sort of noteworthy or interesting is because this person happens to be an amputee, but I just see a person doing exercise, which, given my level of exercise or interest in exercise, is kind of a little bit exceptional, but that's beside the point. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we want to do when we're talking about more positive representations of disabled people is to try and reframe that and sort of turn it around, as Nicole was talking about earlier when we were talking about models of disability, to something that's more positive. So this is one of my favorite quotes by Stella Young. She says, that quote, "The only disability in life is a bad attitude. The reason that's bullshit," and it is bullshit, "is because no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made a turn into a ramp. No amount of standing in the middle of a bookshelf and radiating a positive attitude is going to turn those books into braille." So she's saying that no matter, what a disabled person's perspective or the people around us perspective is on things, we really need to be focusing on the barriers, the challenges. And it's not that we can solve all these problems by just having a can-do attitude. Next slide. So the two kind of tips or tricks that I would give to trying to reframe or push away from the superscript narrative is to ask the question, is this story newsworthy if the person wasn't disabled? And if not, then question, why is it framed that way? Is there something specific about this that makes it interesting? Is it the fact that a barrier was removed? Is it the fact that a system was changed? That's interesting, right? But the other part, and the other thing I think is really useful, is to ask, is disability even relevant to the story? Because very often it's not. It's a story about a person doing a thing, and that's an interesting thing. And disability is just something that is happening in the background. It shouldn't be part of the story, so why are we making it so? Next slide. So there's another model of disability that I think is also relevant to these representations of disabled people, which is the charity model. And this is one that I guess the disabled community has been fighting against for a very long time and trying to push back against. But this sort of sees disability as a personal misfortune or tragedy, and that disabled people must be sort of helped out of acts of goodwill rather than because they're people and they deserve the same opportunities as everybody else. It's that, non-disabled people have to be kind and act as saviors for disabled people by doing these kind or generous things. And then disabled people, as a result of that, are often put in a position where they need to appear grateful or brave or uncomplaining to be deserving of help. And that's just not the world that we want to live in. We want disabled people's autonomy, our right to be full independent people, to be respected. And the charity model kind of challenges that. And so that leads to this other representation of disabled people in the media, which is that of the object or burden or the object of care. Next slide, please. So this basically frames, this is a very common representation of disabled people in the media, but it very often frames a disabled person as a source of stress, of hardship or sacrifice for family or carers. And the disabled person in these stories is passive or a burden and is always receiving care, which Gillian's going to talk about that a little bit later. And very often in these stories, the focus is on the carer and the challenges that they have, rather than on the disabled person and the fact that they are not getting the supports and services that they need without it being given by, say, a family member or somebody who needs more support. And so in those situations, the personalities, the needs, the want, the humanity of the actual disabled person gets forgotten about. And we're treated as kind of these objects that need to be looked after rather than human beings that need to be supported and been given the space to develop to be the best versions of ourselves that we can be. And very often in these stories, the medical or intimate details of a person's lives end up being kind of spread across the stories. So details of people's sleeping habits or toilet requirements or things like this, stuff that just is nobody's business. Next slide. And very often when we talk about these stories about disabled people and about their families and, the challenges that people have in supporting disabled people, they're often told in this context where there's a lack of proper support for disabled people. And so a really important thing that we want to highlight is that we don't want to see a situation where we're not talking about these challenges. We want to talk about the fact that there is not enough supports for disabled people to live in the community. We want to talk about the fact that there are many people who are at home and are struggling to take care of a relative, but we don't want that disabled person to become invisible as part of that. And so the question is not whether we tell these stories, but how we go about telling these stories. And we're going to give some tips on how to do that a little bit down the line. And I guess a little point that we want to make at this point is that when we talk about vulnerability, because disabled people are very often described as being vulnerable, the thing that we always try to emphasize within Disabled Women Ireland is that vulnerability is not something that a person is born with. It is something that it comes about because of circumstances. When a person is properly supported and has access to all of the resources that they need, they will not be vulnerable. Vulnerability is caused by not having what people need that makes them vulnerable to harm. And so what happens when we talk about disabled people in these ways? Well, there's four kind of main things. So the first is internalized ableism. And internalized ableism is this idea of how disabled people think about themselves, right? And so this is kind of the very personal aspect. When we talk about disabled people either as being kind of, fantastic for doing very basic things, or talking about disabled people as being purely passively cared for objects, then that impacts how a disabled person sees themselves. And we really want to support disabled people to have very positive perspectives on themselves and to not be battling internalized ableism. But if we take a step out from the individual and we think about kind of as a society, the impacts that has, one of the big things that we see is that this causes harm when we're trying to campaign for better supports and services for disabled people. It can very often undermine our efforts. So, for example, we're seeing this a lot in the conversations around social welfare. We want disabled people to be better supported by social welfare systems. But when we talk about disabled people as burdens or as passive objects of care, then people see things like social welfare as handouts rather than as investment in disabled people and in disabled people's well-being. The other thing that tends to happen is that the public debate around disability ends up being distorted. So very often, because we have these non-empowering ways of talking about disabled people, then the authority and the expert status of disabled people also ends up being challenged. So we're considered to be non-expert witnesses in our own experiences. And we're talking a lot nowadays about lived experience and the importance of talking about lived experience. And really, we need to be finding ways to talk about disabled people, of helping disabled people to tell their own stories in the ways that work for them. And that recognize their expertise. And so, for example, one of the things that we saw over in the UK is that conversations around assisted dying, which is a very big kind of policy or legislative conversation in the UK, is happening at the moment. But very often, disabled people are considered to be too biased to talk about these issues. And we're not. We're experts. We have a particular perspective on it. And we need to talk about disabled people in empowering ways to kind of reinforce that expertise. And the other thing that happens, and this is at the very extreme end of the scale, is the justification of violence against disabled people, which I'm not going to talk about. Gillian's going to touch on that later on. So next slide. At the start, I told you there was 3 common representations. So here's my third one. Next slide. My third one is that very often disabled people are just not spoken about in the media. A very common way in which disabled people are spoken about in the media is that we're not covered. And so very often disabled people are spoken about in things that very specifically relate to disabled people. But when we're talking about bigger stories or different conversations, the voice of disabled people is just entirely absent, even if we have a particular perspective or angle that will be very important for people to understand. So I have a photo of my own face on this slide because, for example, one of the things that Disabled Women Ireland did a couple of years ago was talk about lockdown. So disabled people were entirely left out of the conversation around COVID-19, and particularly about opening back up and about the shift back to in-person meetings and in-person events. And this is one of the things that we were talking about. But actually, the entire reason why Disabled Women Ireland exists is that back in 2021, when Ireland was repealing the Eighth Amendment to legalise abortion in Ireland, we felt that disabled women were just not being talked about at all, by anybody. And so one of the reasons why we formed and why we came together was to actually bring that unique perspective, that specific perspective. And why do we think that that's happening? Well, very often it's because if disabled people are missing from the narrative, it's also because there is no disabled person behind the scenes pushing for our stories and our perspectives to be told. So our stories just don't make it to the front page. Next slide. And so one of the things I think is really important to remember or bear in mind is that when we're in a room, what is considered normal is whatever is considered normal by the people in that room. And so when disabled people are absent from the room, it's maybe considered normal or feel normal to not talk about disability. And so we really need to get more disabled people into newsrooms and really across all of broadcast media. And this is something that we're going to cover in sessions 2, 3, and 4 of our webinar series. Next slide. I'm going to finish off by just giving you one example. I promise I'm not an utter egotistical narcissist by putting 4 photos of myself on a slide. There's a very good reason for it. I might still be an egotistical narcissist, but not for this reason. So the other thing that I do in relation to other than disability advocacy is my other hat is that I've done a couple of bits of TV broadcasting, TV presenting for both kids and adults. And so as a result of that, I've been engaging with journalists and talking to journalists about sort of my experiences. Next slide. And the thing that I've really been trying to do is to push the narrative away from myself and my disability to start talking about what are the barriers and what are the enablers. So this, for example, is an article where I was interviewed by the local paper. And the thing that I pushed in this article was, so there's to explain what's on the slide, it's just a photo of my face and a headline about me returning to school to talk about students. And the quote from me is that I was incredibly lucky. And so what I said in this article was that it definitely had challenges in terms of accessibility. That's my school, but I was incredibly lucky in that I had a full-time SNA, Marianne, and honestly, I wouldn't have been able to do it without her. I'm very conscious that not every disabled student gets the level of support that I got. So that's how we take a story where they were asking me a question about my disability, and I went, no, we're not talking about that. We're going to talk about what was it that enabled me to get through school. Okay, it was the fact that I had access to supports. And I'm also very aware that not every disabled student gets the support that I have. Next slide. One other small example was for my sins. I was on TV a while ago, and again here, the question was how do we get more disabled people to do science communication and onto telly? And the focus that I put here is that it's important that we show that disabled people, irrespective of your background, and provided you are given the right supports and the right help, you can do X, Y, Z. So again, we're focusing on the supports and the enablers rather than on the disabled person, because really that's the less interesting part of the story. So those are my own experiences, my own sort of tips and tricks on how to do it. And I believe I'm handing over to Gillian next. Yes.
Hello. Now I am very conscious that I don't have very much time left, so this will be a whistle-stop tour. It's just really summing up a lot of what has been spoken about before, but specifically looking at parenting. So basically what Amy was referring to there is what's known as epistemic injustice. So the idea that people can be unfairly discriminated against in their capacities as knowers or in their capacity to talk about their own experiences based on prejudice to do with their gender, social background, ethnicity, but also disability. And it's really important just to highlight that this isn't always overt discrimination. A lot of this comes down to unconscious bias because of those narratives that Naomi was talking about, because of the superscript, because of the medical model, because of all of these things. And sometimes we need to sit and go, am I not centering this person because of these biases? Not because you're trying to be deliberately discriminate against people, but we all have biases, and sometimes we need to reflect on those biases. So Fricker, who's the person who came up with the definition of epistemic injustice, identifies two primary types of epistemic injustice: testimonial injustice and hermeneutical. Oh God, I've been practicing that word for the whole day and I still got it wrong. So testimonial injustice is where somebody's lived experience or that when they're speaking about their own life, it's dismissed because he's prejudiced. The hermeneutical injustice is where experience and perspectives of members of the community aren't shown in the dominant narrative, and therefore members of that community are suffering an injustice of not being able to see themselves represented in wider society. So this comes back to the idea, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So if you are invisible, and I suppose just to tie back to what Nem was saying about neurodivergent people, this is one of the reasons so many neurodivergent people are late identified, because the dominant narrative has been, you have to be male, you have to be white, you have to be cishet. So it's just something to bear in mind. And it also ties into the disability mantra, which is the way we always speak, and we're constantly bringing it up, but nothing about us without us. If you're doing a story, if you're creating anything to do with disability, there needs to be disabled people involved. Next slide, please, Nicole. Sorry. I'm also recovering from bronchitis, so I do apologize for my voice. It keeps on coming and going. So how does this show up for disabled parents? I am a disabled parent of disabled children, so I do know what this feels like and how it shows up. And how it shows up is that we have people fighting for supports for either themselves or for their children, that they are entitled to, that they are legally entitled to, that they are morally entitled to. But we have a situation now where people feel like they have to stand outside the door with pictures of their children to fight for these supports. Is that ethical? Is it fair? We are constantly, as parents, told that we have to speak about our children on their worst day. When we are interviewed, we are asked to talk about our children, their struggles, their difficulties, basically to give their sob story in order to be listened to, in order to force through change, in order that the wider public will feel sorry for us and put pressure on the government to actually do their job. And this violates our children's right to privacy, which is covered both in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but also in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It also causes harm. It causes harm to constantly have to speak about your children in this way. It causes harm to disabled people to constantly have to talk about themselves in negative ways. It causes psychological harm, and it is something, sometimes you can mitigate that harm, or you can, I don't use take the knock, but you can decide, okay, this is something, this cause is big enough and I want to talk about this. But it is always a cost. It is always a cost. And therefore it is something to be mindful for. When somebody shares their story with you, it is costing them something. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. Sorry, I'm trying to rush through, and I do apologize to the interpreters if I'm speaking too quickly. Another aspect that we see is that parenting a disabled child can often feel, particularly when you're disabled yourself and may have difficulties accessing spaces, it can feel quite isolating. It can feel quite lonely. And so what happens is, an awful lot of times, is that people will turn to people on social media who are talking about their lived experience. Oftentimes, this is parents and carers of disabled people rather than disabled people themselves. There are a lot of really good, and I'll include some of them in the resources, there are a lot of really good disabled influencers. That's not who I'm focusing on right now. I'm focusing on people who have monetized their their children's disability. And the reason they do it is because it's lucrative. It is very, very lucrative. But it is also causing an enormous amount of harm. And again, in the resources, I have links to what this goes. Oftentimes, they are speaking about their children in very much the object and burden of care models. They are talking about the difficulties they're discussing their children's toileting habits, showing them a meltdown, showing their struggles, and talking about how hard it is for them as parents to have to deal with this. And I'm going to cover a story that will show why this is so harmful and why these framings are so harmful. But I just wanted to highlight it because it is something that very much impacts on parents and parenting. And it, as a disabled person, it does not feel nice to see this this portrayal and people talking about how hard you were to live with as a child. But it's just something that I wanted to highlight again. I'll move forward, Nicole. So sorry, my voice is going all over the place. Now I'm going to look at 2 articles. What I'm going to look at is difficult. This isn't an easy topic to talk about. So I would like people to be mindful of themselves in it. I am not going to focus too much on the details of it. I really want to look at the story and what's said and what's not said and the way that it is said. But it is talking about a child dying. So if that is something that you don't feel that you have the capacity for right now, please don't feel like you have to stay. And just for people who may be watching the recording, you might want to skip forward. Next, please. So just to sum up, the dominant media framing erases disabled people who are parents, partners, friends, and carers themselves. And this causes a huge division between the disabled community and the caring community because there's a feeling like we have to fight to get our stories heard. We have to fight for the scraps of representation there is. But it also completely negates the fact that an awful lot of disabled people are parents. We are parents and carers. So where are our stories in that? It ignores reciprocity. Geez, I've got all the big words. So care within relationships. It negates peer support and mutual aid within disabled communities. And it reinforces that idea that disabled people are net takers from families and the state, that we're a burden, that we cost too much, that if I see the sentence, my tax dollars or my tax money paying for you, it must be nice to stay at home all day. Those kind of narratives. That's what's feeding into this. Okay, the next slide, please. Sorry. This is obviously the extreme, but what happens when we talk about disabled people in this way? Many of you may not be aware of this day. It's the 1st of March. It's the Disability Day of Mourning. And what the disabled community do on this day is we remember all the people, all the disabled people who were killed by family members and caregivers and intimate partners. It's not an easy website to look at, but it is important that we remember. And unfortunately, this is something that does happen. And I am now going to look at a case that happened in Ireland. I'm looking at a story that was in the Irish Examiner. This is not to put the Irish Examiner on blast. It's just that I'm going to do a compare and contrast in 2 stories, and I wanted to have them from the same source. But this story was covered by all the major news outlets. It was covered by RTE. The language and the framing that was used was the same across all of them. So it didn't really matter which one of the stories or articles I chose. This was the way it was framed. And that's the bit that's important. So I'm just going to Could I just ask, I know people are using the chat, could I just ask it that you don't when I'm talking about this and when I'm talking, because I'm ADHD and I'm finding it really distracting and I'm finding it hard to focus, if that's okay with people. The next bit that I'm going to go into, Nicole, if you can click on the first link, that would be great. So again, I'm not going to focus on the details of this story, but what happened was a mother took the life of her small child because she became obsessed and overwhelmed with the child's autism diagnosis. If you could just move up a bit, please, underneath the picture, please, Nicole. No, the other way, sorry, the other way. Sorry. So, in the days prior, she carried out internet searches on suicide and mothers killing their autistic children. She had convinced herself that the child had a more severe form of autism when the diagnosis was at the milder end of the spectrum. Again, that comes into that language of function, labels and everything. But what's not being said is, if the child had more complex needs, would that be a reason that it was okay? That's not okay. So, sorry, could you go down a little bit more underneath the picture again? So, again, this framing of scored on the borderline spectrum of autism, that's not a thing. So, Mr. Murray read a statement from the woman's husband, said his wife had been Googling autism and found a form of autism called pathological demand avoidance. She immediately convinced herself that this is what the child had. But at the very worst, she had mild autism. I should point out at this juncture, I am PGA, so this is a little bit difficult for me to read. The next bit, sorry. The woman's sister said in a statement, read to the court, that the accused became totally obsessed with autism and was always on the internet researching it. This is what I want to highlight. This woman was looking at these stories that we're talking about. She was looking at these influencers. She was looking at this tragedy narrative, and she convinced herself that this was an absolute, the end of her life as she knows it, basically. It says she was cracking up, she was overwhelmed, she became obsessed. Sorry, if you can go up again. I'm sorry, Nicole, this is difficult. Sorry, the other way, Nicole, sorry. If I say go up, it's the other way, sorry. So she felt desperate, she felt in a panic, she felt totally alone. Again, we'll just go up so we're not leaving on the details, if you don't mind, Nicole. And this last bit, up again. So she's talked about, I did love her very much. I just wanted the best for her. It was all go. I had to do it. She felt like it was the end of the world. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Nicole, if you could go up again. I'm really sorry about this, lads. It's very difficult. Could you, sorry, Nicole, I need you to go up a little bit more, please. Yeah. Okay. Up to the end, if you don't mind. Next. The woman did not know she was doing, a friend committing the act. So, this woman openly said that the way that autism and autistic people were framed is what contributed. She felt like she had to do it so her other child could have a decent life, a good life is the way she put it. And she felt completely overwhelmed and alone. Another thing, so this is the harm that these stories and framing of these stories can happen. Obviously, this is a very extreme case, but this is not the only case in Ireland. This is not the only case globally. The other thing that I wanted to just point out in this story, do you know any more about that child than the fact that she was autistic? Do you know what her likes and dislikes were? Do you know how she got on with her family? Do you know what her sibling relationship was like? We know nothing about that child because nothing about that child was centered in that story. And that, unfortunately, is a very common theme when these cases are discussed. That the disabled child is absent completely from any reporting of these things. And would that happen if that child was non-disabled? Would we hear about how their classmates were so upset? Would we hear about how much they were loved? Would we hear about the things that they enjoyed? We would. So why didn't we hear it in that story about a disabled child? And just quickly, I am very aware, this is another story. It's a parent talking about his autistic child. I'm not going to go into all of it because, and we will link it, the hyperlink will be there for you. If we can just go down to the very end. Sorry, because I don't have time to go through it all. But in this story, they're talking about their autistic child. They are talking about their concerns. They are talking about the lack of supports. They are talking about how lucky they feel to be able, that they've got support, but that there's problems in the wider. So they're talking about all of these things. They're centering all of these things in the story. And they're talking about things that can be difficult for them, that they oftentimes they don't have somebody that they can necessarily rely on to look after their children, but at no point do they blame their child for that. At no point do they say in this story, he's made our life so difficult. It's so difficult. People don't understand how hard we have it because of him. At no point do they do that. What they do is they talk about him as a human being. And this is an example of how to do this right. And I just wanted to, this final sentence, praising a child like he should. Shouldn't be so mind-blowing and out of the ordinary that I have to comment on it, but it actually is. And it's just something to bear in mind. So I'm going to finish there because as you can hear, I'm losing my voice. So thank you very much.
So thanks, Gillian. I'm going to finish off by one very small point. On and just kind of, I guess, Gillian's given a great example of kind of a great way that we can tell stories about disabled people, and less great ways. But we just want to kind of really concretize that, make that very concrete. So next slide. And the way in which we do that basically is by focusing on disabled people in ways that kind of reflect both the social and the human rights models of disability. So this is what Nicole was speaking about at the beginning, but in real practical terms, what that looks like is, next slide, is talking about two very key things. So the first thing is about how we tell the story, the first piece of advice that we would have, which is that while we talk about disabled people, we really want to talk about the barriers and the enablers. What the barrier is the interesting part of the story, not the fact that it's a disabled person experiencing the barrier, but the interesting part is it is the broken lift, it's the resources that aren't there, it's the inaccessible building. And we can talk about how that impacts a disabled person and why it impacts them more to a greater extent than a non-disabled person. But we want to do that in a way that reflects this kind of very human rights or social models of disability. So one that really centers the personality, the humanity, and the dignity of the disabled person, and instead focus on the systemic issues that created the barrier to begin with. And this is something that, like, investigative journalism and many other areas there's a principle of investigative journalism of trying to look at systems and where they have failed people, and that is the story rather than and the person in those stories is the way in which we tell, is the way in which we find a hook to talk about the barriers and the challenges in the system. And then our other main piece of advice is to think about who is telling the story and who is part of telling that story. So the key thing that we would like to see more of is more disabled people themselves being spoken to about issues impacting disabled people, instead of family members or carers or other representative organizations. There is a place and a space for other organizations to support in these stories, but we really want the disabled people themselves to be at the very core and the very heart, because those are the people that have the expertise, they have the lived experience. We also want to see more people working with disabled journalists and others in media organizations. And then also, I would say a shameless plug, but we don't actually get anything for it monetarily other than just knowing that we're trying to make the world a bit of a better place, but talk to disabled persons organisations. People like Disabled Women Ireland and the other 9 national DPOs and many local DPOs, at least here in Ireland, we can talk about these stories, and we do very happily engage with the media on stories, and we can give you that framing that is much more human rights based. But also the disabled people at the centre of the stories can do that anyway. So that's our 2 tips. Look at how you tell the story and who takes part in telling that story. And on that note, we're going to move to the Q&A. Now, we know that we've gone a little bit over time. We'll remind you that we've recorded this session. We're going to stop the recording from the Q&A, but if anybody has to leave, that's absolutely fine. We're going to hang on for a little bit longer to go through the Q&A.